Hello. Welcome back to another edition of Online Theater School. This is chapter 6. How's everybody doing, by the way? I hope you're doing all right. For those of you who had an issue with the quiz on Good Friday, please note that that was set to auto-release on Good Friday, not in spite of it being Good Friday. So that's why I reopened the quiz. I assume you've all done it by this point. I believe you have until the end of today to do it. So let me know if you have any problems with that. We're going to talk about directing and origins of theater. I'm going to do them in two separate videos. Both of these chapters are long, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. I know that I say that every single week, and then I end up going like 15, 20 minutes. I'm really going to try to keep it under 10 for you today. We'll see how it goes. So the important thing about directing, a couple of notes about that. There is not one school of thought on how one directs or how one should direct. There are some basic structures in place, right? Understanding every director is going to have to go through the process of finding a producer. Every director is going to have to get a play and get approved to get the copyright to it and have the theater pay for it. Every director is going to have to go through a rehearsal process and an audition process and a production process. But the minutia of technique or approach from a conceptual standpoint is different from everybody. Much like other things, there are schools and schools and schools of thought on this process, and every school thinks that they're the best. So my goal here is to just kind of give you a very broad stroke overview of the directing as a process and its history. Relatively new invention. If we look at like it's kind of like a 3,000 foot historical view, the emergence of a director has only recently become a thing. In fact, as late as the 19th century and early 20th century, we get into the idea of a modern director, a person who is like conceptualizing and implementing a production that has harmony and unity, all that kind of stuff. The earliest days of theater in places like Greece, there was a director, but it was mostly considered a matter of instruction, like, okay, first this happens, then this happens, and then this happens. In fact, the Greek word for the director, which I don't know if I can pronounce this correctly, is a didaskalos, which basically means teacher. The idea was that they were the person who knew the most, and it was their job simply to convey that information to people who were less experienced. Similar in medieval times, from about 500 AD, 400 AD, up until about 1400 AD, the Middle Ages, right up to the Renaissance. The designation was that of the master of the production. And again, simply to teach the information about the play to younger people who don't know that much. There was an underlying assumption that a director was a teacher, and that they had mastered that subject, and it was their responsibility to pass it down, essentially. And that kind of directing lasted until well into the 19th century. And really reached its pinnacle of influence during that Victorian era, especially with the concept of like science and the scientific method. There was a very rubricized approach to the process of directing. But that changed in the mid-19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. A group of directors emerged that were doing things very differently, and that coincided with the development of realism, obviously. And the first person who we would consider like the first modern director, or the father of modern directing, would be a guy named George II, the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen. who was a German dude, and his company produced plays that absolutely marveled and floored German audiences during that time period, late 19th century. The acting, the staging, and the scenery. Not only was it historically accurate, it was unified aesthetically and conceptually. The other thing is that up to that point, the way that theater had been done was that there would be like a lead actor who was famous, and everyone else's job was simply to stand there like talking props and support that one actor or actress in their process. This was the first time where everyone who was on stage was on the same page. It truly was the creation of ensemble. The idea that we're all working together to tell a story, not just supporting one famous person who's out front saying all the lines. That seems really obvious, in this day and age, but back then that was a really new thing. It was a very novel concept and something that they were not used to. So it was really quite a marvel. It was dazzling for people to see that at that point. There were similar movements happening not only in Germany but also in places like France and Russia, with guys like Andre Antoine, Konstantin Stanislavski, who we talked about in the acting chapter. They were innovating techniques and actor coaching that was based on some of the Duke of Saxe-Meinigen's ideas and concepts. The importance of those directors was not simply that they fostered realistic naturalist drama, but also, more importantly, that they opened up theater to the concept of limitless possibilities, right? That, hey, we could take a script and we could interpret it any way we want. That was a new idea back then. We've talked a little bit about A Doll's House, and the radical nature of Ibsen's plays, the idea that a woman could think for herself at that time and make a decision like that. Radical. Similar with this, the idea that theater presents infinite possibilities, and it's not just verisimilitude. Pop quiz. What's verisimilitude? The appearance of truth on stage, right? And that opened up. So the directors working in verisimilitude and naturalism and realism opened up the idea that you could interpret a play any way you wanted to, right? And you could even interpret it psychologically, abstractly. And so, as we talked about with plays, we talked about the difference between realism and anti-realism. There was also a set of anti-realist directors as well. And this was a third phase right after realism, which happened kind of in the early 20th century. And this was the place where the director as a job, the idea of a director, really moved up to a place of power and prominence in the theater. A person who was creative and original and, conceptual and all that kind of stuff. And that those directors' goals were to get away from intentionally the rigid structures of verisimilitude and to create beauty and brilliance. Cohesiveness of elements that don't necessarily go together, etc. Some of those artists were guys like Vladislav Meyerhold and Paul Fort. They created techniques that were a direct assault on realism, intentionally sort of shoving their techniques in realism's face. The most influential, however, of the anti-realist directors, the conceptual directors, was a guy named Edward Gordon Craig. Wrote an essay in 1905 called The Art of Theater, and he compared in it the job of a director to that of the captain of a ship. Strict discipline. A director controls every facet, every minute detail of how the story's told and what's going to happen. And this was the first time that he sort of created the concept through that of the idea of the independent director, that it was a job not just given to the person who knew the most, but a person who was hired to go and direct a show and bring a concept to that production. And then we move from there. Obviously, once that's in it, then we have the idea of the contemporary director. This is the age of the director. Craig's Renaissance has arrived in many ways. The directorial function now is fully established and is fully a part of the idea of bringing the synthesis of a script together. Very quickly, directing process, as I said at the beginning, every process is different. The textbook lays out a very specific and rigid process. Not everyone follows that process. But basically, you're going to deal with a preparation period where you pick the play, you find money, you find a producer, you get the copyright, so on and so forth. And there's a question within there about how one chooses a play. And I'm not going to really get into that because I don't know that you're very interested in that, but just know that a director has to have some kind of an eagerness or connection to the work that they choose to direct. If someone calls up a director and says, hey, I want you to come direct this, a director shouldn't immediately say yes. They should say, well, let me look at it and see if it moves me. I have something called the rule of 10 that I use, which is basically I read a play 10 times. And after the 10th read, if I am still moved by the play, I think it's something that I might be interested in directing. And that has saved me on a number of occasions from directing a bunch of crap that I wasn't interested in. That can change a little bit, that process, if you have to adapt a play. If the director is the adapting person, or if you're working with a playwright to adapt a work, so on and so forth. But that's a whole thing, choosing the play and how you go about choosing the play. There's obviously a conceptualizing period where you have to read the play a bunch of times, analyze it, think about it, figure out what is this saying to you, right? What's the high image in the play, or what the book calls the core concept. It separates the idea of the core concept from the high concept, right? The core concept is something that a guy named Lajos Egri, who is a professor of playwriting, he talks about this idea of the core concept. He calls it premise, or that idea of the cosmic truth of the play. The director's got to find what that is, because there's one in every single play, and you got to be able to find it. High concept is the idea of not cosmic truth, but the idea of taking a play and moving it out of its context and into something else, right? So taking, for example, I don't know, Henry IV, and taking it out of the Middle Ages and putting it in a prison, right? That would be a high concept. So you're taking it, you're creating a new concept around an old idea. So after that, you move into the implementation period, which is where you're selecting and partnering up with your designers. You are collaborating with them. You're going through the audition process. You're casting the actors. And then, of course, you move into the rehearsals and the staging process. What's interesting is, and I can't really draw this out for you, but I'll kind of do it on the screen. If this part right here is the rehearsal phase, when you get to the actual rehearsal part of your production as a director, then right here is everything else. This is the bulk of the job that has to be done before you walk into the rehearsal room in order to start. If you haven't done that, then your actors, especially if they're good actors, will know that you're not prepared. And so a director's job, from the standpoint of a modern director, is very, very independent and very large and very important, is kind of the point of this whole thing. Good directors, really good directors, are not a dime a dozen. Directors are a dime a dozen. Good directors are not. And it is something much like Kung Fu, if you will, or Buddhism, that requires a lifetime of mastery in order to really understand what your process is and what the journey that you have taken to get to that process looks like. And so that's why it's really fun to talk about. We could go on and on and on about this. Of course, my video here has gone 15 minutes again. Sorry about that. That was as fast as I could go through this. But that's pretty much the stuff that you need to know. Anything else you can see in the notes. So enjoy. That's directing.